As we saw in Part 1, the United States has made it very clear that the Western Hemisphere is off limits for other great powers, but that we have carte blanche to intervene whenever we feel there is a threat to our security.
When the United States invited Georgia and the Ukraine to join NATO, Russia attempted to communicate that it saw this issue as a similar threat to its security. But the United States either was unable to understand or chose to ignore Russia's concerns. The United States continued to push NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. In August of that year, Russia invaded Georgia. You don't have to approve of Putin's actions to realize they were fairly predictable. A few months later, Russian troops withdrew, perhaps in an effort to signal that this was not an attempt to take over Georgia
so much as a way of communicating the intensity of their objections. In 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych announced his plan to move Ukraine into a closer relationship, both economically and politically, with Russia.
There was no decision on this question that Yanukovych could have made that would have been universally popular, because Ukraine was profoundly split on whether it wanted to consider itself a Western European country or an Eastern European country connected more closely with Russia. But there was pretty universal disgust with what Ukrainians perceived correctly as high levels of corruption in the Ukrainian government.
Many Ukrainians thought that Putin had either bribed or threatened Yanukovych. True or not, this made Yanukovych a target for anti-corruption anger. And this anger, combined with unhappiness by the plurality of Ukrainians who preferred ties with the European Union,
gave fuel to massive protests,
which eventually drove Yanukovych out of office and out of the country. Russia accused the United States of having encouraged the protest and fomenting revolution. It's likely that the accusations of both American and Russian involvement are true. This, after all, is the kind of thing great powers do. The new Ukrainian government was not as favorably disposed towards Russia as was Yanukovych. Reading the writing on the wall, Putin may have sensed that the decision was going against him. In quick strikes, Russia conquered Crimea and the Donbas regions of Ukraine, regions that were somewhat more tied to Russia historically and culturally than the rest of Ukraine. You probably know the more recent history pretty well. In 2021, Russia quite publicly began concentrating troops near its border with Ukraine. NATO demanded that Russia stand down and put its own troops in Eastern Europe on alert. Russia announced its own requirements, which they argued were necessary in order to ensure their security. These included a demand that Ukraine never join NATO.
As you know, these negotiations failed to prevent war.
At the time I'm making this video, the Russian offensive has gone worse than expected, but the end of the war is still nowhere in sight. Hopefully by the time you see this, the war will be over, but one way or another, more will be known. So I just want to leave you with two quick thoughts.
Why was it that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended the way it did, with the Soviet Union removing their missiles?
One approach focuses on the individual leaders involved, but realists, as you know, are more interested in geostrategic considerations of national interests. And realists would argue that there was no way that Cuba, less than 100 miles from the coast of Florida, could ever be as important to the Soviet Union halfway around the world as it was to the United States. By that same logic, can the Ukraine, which before this crisis had probably not crossed the minds of most Americans in years, ever be as important to us as it is to Russia, which shares a border? Will Americans be willing to sacrifice as much as Russia is if perhaps this conflict drags on for years? To complete our analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis,
there is a way that the individual characteristics and decisions of Kennedy and Khrushchev were extraordinarily significant.
Kennedy, after all, gave the Soviet Union an out, a way for them to claim some victory at home and avoid humiliation while still backing down.
I hope that US and NATO leaders are wise enough to leave Putin a similar out and avoid backing Putin into a corner.